Welcome back to my channel. It's time for another Tuesday tips. We are working with our basic overlocker, so I'm taking you through all the basics that you need to know. I also just wanted to say thank you. We've received so many emails from you after our part 1 that we've posted, and I really appreciate all the comments that you're making and saying that you are starting to understand your overlocker. So thank you so much for emailing me. Today I'm going to talk to you about cutting width and differential. I'm taking you through the steps as you would set up your machine when you're going to sew with your fabric. The first steps was we were talking about needles and threads and about the importance of threading, and now I'm going to talk to you about cutting width and differential. I need to make sure that my cutting width is correct for the fabric that I'm working on. Now, if we're looking at our overlocker, and I'm just going to open up here. I know you guys won't be able to see as close up, but if you look at the picture, I have a bottom blade and I have my top blade, which is cutting from the top. Now, my blade on the top actually is literally from the top. But some of you, your top blade or the cutting blade will still be connected at the bottom. It's just the movement that's a bit different, but it's still cutting from the top. Now, what we want to do is set in our cutting width. When we're working with our dowel, there's my dowel for the cutting width, it will move the bottom blade. Now, my cutting width dowel is this knob. You might find with your overlocker that you've got to open the side door and you will find your cutting width knob on the inside. And another difference is that my cutting width is numbered, so some of the machines will have a numbered 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. Some of them are even 1 to 3, and some of them will just be blank. If it's blank, I'm going to suggest that if you get your perfect cutting width, if you've tested and you know that is a perfect cutting width for wovens, maybe just make a little bit of a mark for yourself with a black marker, so that when you set in, you can always just go back to your basic setting. From there, it's so easy that if I need to tweak it, to just do slightly go up or down and just move it maybe a millimeter in or out, to the left or to the right. So this is really, for me, really important when we are working with our fabrics to make sure that my cutting width is correct. Now, I want to explain to you what does the cutting width do. Now, that bottom blade is cutting my fabric. If you see the picture that I'm showing you now, that is a stitch finger that we find on the overlocker where my stitches are formed. The stitches literally goes, if this is my stitch finger, that thread literally goes and it gets interlocked on the edge of that stitch finger, the bottom and the top looper interlocked, and that is where my stitch is formed. Now, if you look at my fabric, if I am sewing and my cutting width is correct, my fabric, let's imagine I'm working with, this is my hand, let's go back to this. So let's imagine this is my fabric, this is my stitch finger. Now, what you will find is if this fabric is nice on the edge, not over the edge, I can even just see a little bit of that silver shining through, then I'm on the perfect cutting width. It's going to make a perfect overlock stitch for me. If I'm wrong and my cutting width isn't correct, I might be working with that stitch finger and my fabric is sitting there and I'm seeing a lot of that silver part of the stitch finger. My stitches are still forming over the stitch finger. So what's going to happen as my fabric is moving off, all these lashes that's formed on the edge will actually be hanging off my fabric. Now, the total opposite is where my fabric is actually lying over my stitch finger. I cannot see the silver of that stitch finger. Now, what's going to happen as I'm sewing, obviously with that stitches forming, it's pulling my fabric in a little bit and I'm going to get tunneling on my fabric. So that is really why our cutting width is so important. I don't want that tunneling and I really don't want those lashes hanging off either. So we've got to get that balance correct, and that's why I want you to mark it. If you don't have a number on there, mark it for yourself. On a woven fabric, I'm getting the perfect stitch. I know with my overlocker, I'm on a 2, and then I will always get a perfect stitch on my wovens. Now I'm working with a thicker fabric and it might be pulling in too much, then I'm going to go and set my cutting width. If it's showing lashes on a thinner fabric, again, I'm going to set it in. And all it really is, guys, that cutting width, so many people, when they get that lashes or the tunneling, they immediately go to their tensions. They think, my tension is too loose, my tension is too tight, whichever way. And in the meantime, it's really just your cutting width that's off. If I'm still interlocking on the edge, that for me is really a sign that I need to go look at my cutting width. I try and explain things, I simplify things in my mind. So I'm trying to explain it to you the way I understand it. I know there's lots of other technical information out there, but I'm a visual person and I'm trying to show you what I look for, because when I start sewing, I look at that stitch finger and I can see, oops, I'm going to get loose lashes because that fabric is lying in the middle of my stitch finger. That is where I look, and that is what's telling me it's correct or it's not correct. So let's do a sample now where we're going to work, and I'm going to move my cutting blade all the way to the left, which is my lowest number, and then I'm also going to do a sample for you where I'm working with the cutting width on my stitch width 5, which means it's all the way to the right, and I'm going to get tunneling. So let's quickly do this exercise. We're going to look at the cutting width now. I've moved my cutting width to the lowest number, and I'm going to now sew it. If you watch, like I mentioned, if you watch that stitch finger, you will see that the fabric will be actually more to the left of the stitch finger, meaning I'm going to get those little lashes hanging off my fabric. Okay, let's have a look at the fabric now. Look at the loops that it's formed for you. Can you see how the fabric is not filling in that stitch area for me? So that means I'm cutting off too much fabric and there's not enough fabric under those stitches. In this case, if that is what your sample will look like, or your fabric's going to look like, you've got to go set your stitch width then, you've got to go set your cutting width, and you will move the cutting width to a higher number so that that bottom blade is moving more to the right. I've moved my blade now all the way to the right, so I've gone to the highest cutting width on my cutting knob that I have on the side there. Now when I'm going to sew it, you will notice that your fabric, if you're sewing at home, please look at your stitch finger. You'll see that the fabric might be going over that stitch finger, and then that stitches that's forming will pull the fabric in a little bit, and I'm going to get my tunneling. Let's have a look at the sample. If you can see now the close-up that I'm showing you, it actually shows you all that tunneling. So you're going to turn that cutting width dial to a lower number so that that blade moves to the left. Now if we're working with knits, you've got to check your differential. We find when we're working with a knit that some of them will stretch out so much and others will stretch out less. It depends on the stretchability and the recovery of that fabric. Now, if I go to my sewing machine and I sew with a knit, I know I'm going to get those waves happening on the seam. And this is where we go to our overlocker because it prevents it from happening. Now, the easiest way for me to explain to you what the differential is if we can look at the feed dogs now, and I'm going to show you how they move and how they work and explain to you how I see it. Again, not in a technical way, guys. I'm not technical. I'm really visual. So I'm really trying to give it over in the way that I'm understanding it. So you'll notice that I have front feed dogs and I have my back feed dogs as well. And then they are, if I look at my differential feed, if you look at your differential feed knob, you will see it will be numbered and it will say 1, 1.5, 2, and it will also go the other way, 1, and it might be 0.7 or 0.5 depending on what your machine will, what your numbers are on your machine. What you will also find that some of them won't have a 1, it will have a normal, an N for normal. That just means it's basically where my 1 would be. Now if we're looking at our feed dogs and I'm turning my flywheel, can you see how they're moving together? Now, if it's a normal or 1 setting, this ratio is basically a 1:1. The amount of fabric that my front feed dogs grip, is, pull in under the presser foot is the amount that's being pulled out the back of the presser foot. Now I'm going to set my machine. So if I go to a higher number, and I just want you to look how my front feed dogs are moving. Can you see that? So my feed dogs, as soon as I turn the dial, will either move to the back or it will move to the front. As soon as I go to a higher number, it goes to the front. And now what that means that if you're thinking that these two are working in a circle, they're both working in a ratio 1:1, so my front and my back will be working together. Now I've gone higher. I've gone to a 1.5 or a 2 ratio. Only the front feed dogs are affected. The back will always stay at that 1 ratio. So that means with the front, it's making a bigger circle almost to feed it in. It's feeding in more fabric now in the front than what's being pulled out the back. It's almost as if it's doing a bit of a faster motion as well. But for me, it's easier to understand if I talk about that circular motion that I have of the feed dog almost with feeding the fabric, because it's really moving to the front, gripping it, pushing it in, going under my plate, and look if I'm turning it under the plate, coming up, gripping my fabric, pushing it in under the presser foot. That is the motion that I have. And now I'm on a higher differential, which means twice the amount of fabric is being gripped or pulled in from the front, pulled into my presser foot in the front, than what's going out at the back. That one is still that 1 ratio, but now I'm pushing in more fabric for this back that's pulling out. And in effect, what's happening, I'm gathering my fabric. Now, perfect for knits when we sew with knits, because it's preventing the stretch in my knits. I also can use this technique or my differential when I am gathering, which I'm also going to show you. Now, if I go to a lower number, my feed dogs in the front have moved to the back. It's moved more to the back. That means now it's a smaller little circle almost that it's forming. My ratio now at the back is still 1. The front I've gone to, my machine goes to 0.7. So it's pushing in less. It's now 0.7 to a 1 ratio. So it's pushing in less fabric in the front under the presser foot than what my back feed dogs are pulling out. So what's happening? My fabric is pulling tight. That is preventing my packers. Guys, that is how easy a differential is to understand. It's either pushing in more fabric to prevent the stretching, or it's pushing in less fabric, which makes my fabric taut, and that is perfect for my fine fabrics where I'm getting puckering, and even when I do my rolled hems, when I get a slight pucker as well. That is basically, in a nutshell, that is what a differential does. So we are going to do a sample now together. I want you to do a sample as well. We're going to do it on a stretch fabric, and we are going to now see on a basic setting of normal or 1 how the fabric reacts, and then we're going to set it in for that fabric so that you can see what the result is afterwards. We're now going to work with our stretch fabric. I've got a bonbon, and you can see there's quite a bit of stretch in this fabric. I do have a lot. I'm going to just sew a normal seam now with my overlocker. I'm working with 2 needles and my 2 loopers, so I'm working with a 4 thread. Remember in the first video I told you that when I'm working a seam and I'm going to just work on the overlocker, not go to my sewing machine, I need the left needle because that is my safety stitch. My differential is set on my normal or my 1. Everything else is still the same. I haven't changed anything else. And now all I'm going to do, I'm going to sew this so that you can see how the fabric reacts. I want to also mention something else. I started off with holding the fabric here. I wanted you to see. Can you see how my fabric is already moving? Now, when we're working with a knit, please work closer to your presser foot. You've got to control the fabric. If you're not controlling the fabric, I'm going to be all over the show when I'm working with this. And I see so many people when they come for classes that they're actually holding their fabric here and they're also stretching a bit. We don't want stretch. I want the feed dogs to do the work. I'm just going to be there to control my fabric. And when that happens, I'm just going to lift this. Can you see what happened when I didn't control it? Now, when I'm controlling, I'm working in front of my presser foot, and all I'm doing, I'm just holding my fabric. I'm guiding it. And this finger is really smoothing it all the time so I stay in a straight line. It's very easy with a very stretchy fabric that it almost feels like it wants to pull to the side. So I've got to control it. If it feels like it's going to move, guys, just again lift your presser foot, bring your fabric in, and let's go sew this. Also, please don't pull. Can you see my fingers are walking that fabric? I don't want any pull on this fabric because then I am stretching it out more. Another tip is when we do get to the finish or the end of the seam, please don't go pull on your fabric. Look at that stretch that's happening as I'm pulling. I take my thread and I just guide my fabric to the side so that I can go and cut. And remember, we always need the tail that's about this length as well. If I go in too close with my first stitch, it might pull it in. So let's have a look at this one now, and I'm going to show you. Can you see that wave? All right, so I've really got quite a bit of, if I had to try and keep it, sorry, I'm keeping it up so it's more difficult to see. Let me just cut this one thread. But if I had this flat and I had to keep the back straight, can you see how it's stretching there? It's really making a wave for me. Now I need to prevent this. Now I'm going to set my machine to a higher differential. Remember, the higher the differential, the more fabric it's pushing in the front. I'm on a 1.5. Again, think in ratio. For me, it's the easiest. The back feed dogs is still 1, front is 1.5, so it's pushing in 1.5 the amount of fabric in the front than what's going out the back. I keep repeating it, but it's important that you understand what your feed dogs are doing so you know how your fabric's going to react. I would, for instance, start on a 1.5, and if it's still stretching out, I will go to a 2 differential to make sure that I'm preventing that stretch. So I've set my machine to a 1.5 differential. So I'm going to now sew this, and then I'm going to show you the difference between the 1.5 and when it was on normal. If by chance it is still stretching on 1.5, I would go and do another sample and I would set it to 2 differential. And then when I'm happy, then I can go ahead and I can go and sew my fabric pieces together. Can you guys also see it's lying flat? You can really see it's lying flat there. If I went higher, because it's flat, I can see if I went any higher, there's still a little bit of puckering there, so I might play between 1.5, but I should be fine with the amount that I've set it at. So let's cut this off, and I'm just cutting a bit off here. I'm just cutting my threads here. So look at the seam now. Can you see how flat that's looking? If I have to compare it to this seam, and I'm going to just put the 2 together. So let's compare the 2 together. I've just cut them a bit shorter so they are exactly the same length. But look, if I keep them together, look what's happened where I didn't work with differential, and look where I've engaged my differential. Look at the difference. And now imagine sewing a whole long seam and my fabric is waving out or stretching out like that. So that is what the differential does when I go to a higher differential setting. It really controls my fabric. And you see the importance of our cutting width and our differential when we are working with our overlocker. Guys, that is purely why I've got my overlocker. When I'm working with knits, I want these functions. I want to be able to control my fabric. I need to be able to control that stretch of my knit fabric as well. So that is really, for me, all the overlocker is about. All the others that we can do with this overlocker is really, for me, just an added bonus. But I literally go to my overlocker every single time when I'm working with knits because I've got my differential. So please go and do these samples now. I want you to really go to the lowest cutting width and go to your highest cutting width. Do your sample for your reference file, and then also take a stretchy fabric and go and do your sample where you're doing it with your differential on your normal or your 1 setting, and then take it for me to a higher setting. If you do have maybe a soft satiny fabric or any really soft sheer fabric, go and again sew it and see if it makes puckers. If it's making puckers, go to a lower setting to prevent that puckers. I also love to go to a lower setting when I'm doing my rolled hems on my woven fabrics. I find sometimes on my soft fabrics, when I do my rolled hem, I do get a bit of puckering right there where my stitches are sitting, and that also again prevents it giving me a beautifully smooth rolled hem, which we will again also be doing in one of our basic lessons that we are doing with you. Now, please go play. This is the best tool you've got in your sewing room. So I really want you to go and play and make friends with your overlocker. And then you can see you can do anything you want with it. I've really now done all the basics. When we start next time, I'm going to take you a little bit more into it now, where we are going to be talking about decorative threads as well, and a couple of other stitches that we can do with our overlocker, like our flat locking. like the rolled hem, and then you are going to just love your overlocker. If you can just get this basics that we've done in the last 2 videos now, you are going to love it. I hope that you guys are now going to start playing with your overlocker and that you are going to be doing a lot of sewing. Enjoy the rest of your week, and then we'll speak to you again next Tuesday with our Tuesday tips.